476 AD. A 14-year-old boy named Romulus sits on the throne of Rome, wearing the purple robes of emperors who once ruled the world. Outside his palace, a Germanic general named Odoacer marches through the streets with his army. Within hours, the boy will be deposed. The imperial regalia will be shipped to Constantinople, and history books will tell you this is the day Rome fell. But here's what they don't tell you. Nothing actually changed that day. The Senate still met. The laws stayed the same. Roman citizens woke up, paid their taxes, and went about their lives. So if Rome didn't fall in 476 AD, when did it actually fall? And more importantly, what really killed the greatest empire in history? Some historians blame Christianity for making Romans weak. Others blame lead poisoning, moral decay, or barbarian invasions. But what if I told you the truth is far more disturbing? Rome didn't fall because it was conquered. It fell because it was too successful to survive. The very things that made Rome great, the military might, the endless expansion, the promise of eternal glory, these were the poisons that slowly killed it over 5 centuries. To understand how the greatest empire in history destroyed itself, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment one man strangled the Republic and created something that was doomed from the start. The year is 27 BC, and the Roman Republic is dying in everything but name. Octavian, soon to be called Augustus, stands before the Senate and performs what many historians consider the greatest political magic trick in history. He claims he's restoring the Republic while actually concentrating power in his own hands. The senators applaud because they're either convinced or terrified. And in that moment, Rome trades its soul for stability. This is where many scholars argue the fall truly begins, not with barbarians at the gates 5 centuries later, but with this lie that everyone agreed to believe. Augustus creates something unprecedented, an empire pretending to be a republic, ruled by an emperor pretending to be a citizen. It works brilliantly for 200 years, but historians debate whether it plants a seed of dysfunction that will eventually consume everything. The problem, as some see it, is simple and fatal. In a republic, power transfers through elections and laws. In a monarchy, it passes through bloodlines. Augustus creates a system with neither, where every succession becomes a potential civil war because there are no clear rules, only precedents that can be ignored whenever convenient. The genius of Augustus, if you can call it that, is that he never officially calls himself emperor. He's the princeps, the first citizen, holding multiple republican offices simultaneously in a way that's technically legal, but completely perverts their original purpose. He's consul, tribune, and pontifex maximus, all at once. He controls the army through proconsular imperium. He controls the treasury. He controls appointments. He controls everything while insisting he controls nothing. The Senate still meets. Elections still happen. The forms of the Republic persist like a corpse that doesn't know it's dead. Though some historians argue this continuity provided valuable stability. But here's what many scholars point out. The Republic was arguably already dead before Augustus delivered the final blow. The century before Augustus saw Rome tear itself apart in civil wars that killed hundreds of thousands. Marius and Sulla butchered each other's supporters in the streets of Rome. The social war nearly destroyed Italy. Spartacus led 70,000 slaves in rebellion and defeated multiple Roman armies. Pirates controlled the Mediterranean. Pompey and Caesar fought for supremacy. The proscriptions under the Second Triumvirate killed thousands of Roman citizens whose only crime was being wealthy enough to confiscate. One interpretation suggests the Republic didn't fall because Augustus was ambitious. But because Republican government couldn't manage an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria. The first century after Augustus dies proves immediately that the succession system contains fatal flaws. Tiberius becomes emperor because he's Augustus's stepson, adopted only after every other potential heir died under suspicious circumstances. Tiberius is competent but paranoid, and he spends the last decade of his reign on Capri, possibly debauching himself according to hostile sources, definitely executing anyone he suspects of disloyalty. When Tiberius dies in 37 AD, possibly smothered with a pillow, though evidence is disputed, Caligula takes over simply because he's related, and the Praetorian Guard supports him. Caligula's reign reveals what some historians see as an uncomfortable truth. Absolute power doesn't just corrupt. It can drive men to extremes, and the imperial system provides no mechanism to remove them except assassination. Caligula starts reasonably enough, but within months he's allegedly declaring himself a god, having conversations with statues of Jupiter, making his horse a consul, and executing people seemingly at random. Modern historians debate how much of this is true versus senatorial propaganda, but the fact that such stories were believable tells you everything about the nature of imperial power. In 41 AD, the Praetorian Guard murders him, along with his wife and infant daughter, because assassination proves to be the only mechanism for removing a bad emperor. The guard finds Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace and declares him emperor because he's the only adult male left in the imperial family. Claudius is physically disabled, possibly has cerebral palsy, and everyone assumes he's incompetent. He turns out to be highly capable, conquering Britain and reforming the bureaucracy. But competence doesn't matter in a system where succession is based on family rather than merit. Most historians believe Claudius's wife Agrippina poisoned him in 54 AD so her son Nero could become emperor, though some scholars question this narrative. Nero is 16 years old when he takes power. Nero's reign is where the system's dysfunction becomes undeniable to contemporary observers. For the first 5 years, he's controlled by his mother, his tutor Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, and the empire runs smoothly. Then Nero decides he wants actual power. He orchestrates his mother's murder in 59 AD after multiple failed attempts, including a collapsible boat that she survives by swimming to shore. He murders his wife. He murders anyone who might challenge him. He performs as an actor and chariot racer in public, which elite Romans consider beneath imperial dignity. When a great fire destroys much of Rome in 64 AD, rumors spread that Nero started it to clear land for his golden palace, though historians debate whether this is true or propaganda. He blames the Christians and has them executed in the arena. In 68 AD, the legions in Gaul and Spain revolt and declare their own emperors. Nero flees Rome and commits suicide, allegedly saying, "What an artist dies in me," as his final words according to ancient sources. His death ends the Julio-Claudian dynasty and reveals what many see as the empire's dirty secret. Emperors are made by armies, not by law or blood or the Senate. The year 69 AD sees 4 different emperors as legions across the empire fight for supremacy. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius each briefly hold power before Vespasian, commanding the legions in Judea, marches on Rome and establishes the Flavian dynasty through military force. This is Rome at its height, remember? This is the Pax Romana that historians often celebrate, though some scholars note the irony. The empire controls everything from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Roman roads connect every province. Roman law governs millions. Roman trade brings silk from China and spices from India. Roman engineering builds aqueducts, amphitheaters, and cities across 3 continents. And yet the political system is so unstable that emperors are routinely murdered, and civil wars erupt every generation. One interpretation suggests this reveals a fundamental contradiction at Rome's core. Here's a controversy that divides historians. Was Rome's military excellence actually what doomed it in the long run? The Roman legion is undeniably the most effective military force the ancient world has ever seen. It's professional, disciplined, well-equipped, and tactically sophisticated. Roman legions conquer everything they encounter. They turn Gaul from a collection of Celtic tribes into a Roman province in less than a decade. They crush the Jewish revolts despite desperate resistance. They push the frontier to the Danube and beyond. Some scholars argue that every conquest makes the empire larger, harder to govern, more dependent on the army, and more vulnerable to military usurpation, though others see this as an oversimplification. The problem, according to some economic historians, compounds because Roman military success requires constant expansion. Much of the Roman economy, particularly in the early empire, is extractive in nature. You conquer a province, enslave portions of the population, confiscate wealth, appropriate land, and use those resources to fund the next conquest. This model arguably remains sustainable only as long as you keep conquering. The moment expansion stops, some argue the system begins to break down. Augustus seems to understand this, which is why his supposed deathbed advice to his successor is to maintain the existing borders and conquer nothing new. But maintaining those borders requires 30 legions, roughly 300,000 professional soldiers plus equivalent numbers of auxiliaries. Paying that army consumes the majority of imperial revenue. The 2nd century brings what historians call the 5 good emperors, and this period reveals another pattern that scholars debate. The Roman system works brilliantly when you get competent rulers and catastrophically when you don't. But there's no institutional mechanism to ensure competence except luck and adoption. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius rule from 96 to 180 AD, and most historians agree this is Rome's golden age. The empire is prosperous, peaceful, and well-governed. Trajan expands the empire to its greatest extent, conquering Dacia and briefly Mesopotamia. Hadrian consolidates the frontiers, building his famous wall across Britain and reforming administration. Antoninus Pius presides over decades of peace. Marcus Aurelius is the philosopher emperor, writing Stoic meditations while defending the Danube frontier. But Marcus Aurelius makes what many historians consider a critical mistake. He names his biological son as successor instead of adopting the most qualified candidate as his predecessors had done. His 4 predecessors maintained the dynasty through adoption, choosing capable men and training them for rule. Marcus breaks this pattern, perhaps from genuine paternal affection, perhaps from dynastic pressure to keep power in the family. His son Commodus is, according to most ancient sources, everything Rome fears: incompetent, cruel, unstable, and obsessed with performing as a gladiator in the arena. He renames Rome after himself, calls himself Hercules incarnate, and allegedly drains the treasury on spectacles and personal indulgence. The Praetorian Guard murders him in 192 AD, strangling him in his bath. What follows is even more revealing about what some see as the empire's fundamental dysfunction. The Praetorian Guard literally auctions off the imperial throne to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus wins by promising each guardsman 25,000 sesterces, according to contemporary accounts. He reigns for 66 days before being executed when Septimius Severus marches on Rome with his legions. Severus's deathbed advice to his sons is brutally honest and tells you everything about what the empire has become. Enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men. This is what Rome represents by 211 AD in the eyes of many historians. The emperor is whoever the army supports, and the army supports whoever pays them most. The 3rd century is where most scholars agree the empire should have died but somehow doesn't, and this is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome has at least 50 emperors, though historians debate the exact count because some reigns are so brief and chaotic that we're not sure who was officially recognized. Most emperors reign for less than 2 years. Most die violently, killed by their own troops, rival generals, or foreign enemies. The typical emperor in this period is a military commander from the provinces, often of non-Italian origin, who rises through the ranks, gets proclaimed by his legions, fights a civil war, briefly holds power, and dies. The crisis of the 3rd century reveals contradictions that historians argue had been building for 3 centuries. The empire is too large to be governed effectively by one man in Rome or even Ravenna. Communication is too slow and it takes weeks to get messages from one frontier to another. Threats are simultaneous on multiple borders. Germanic tribes pour across the Rhine and Danube. The Persian Sassanid Empire conquers Roman territories in the east. In 260 AD, Emperor Valerian is captured by the Persians and dies in captivity, possibly used as a footstool by the Persian king, according to Persian sources that Roman historians naturally disputed. Meanwhile, the empire temporarily splits into 3 pieces: the Gallic Empire controlling Gaul, Britain, and Spain, the Palmyrene Empire controlling Syria and Egypt, and the Rump Empire in Italy, barely holding on. The economy collapses in ways that compound the military disasters, though historians debate the exact mechanisms and severity. Emperors repeatedly debase the currency to pay the army. Under Augustus, Roman silver denarii were 95% silver. By 260 AD, they're less than 5% silver, mostly bronze with silver coating that wears off immediately. Many economic historians argue this triggers spiraling inflation. Trade declines because merchants lose confidence in the currency. The government starts demanding taxes in goods rather than money. Cities shrink as people flee to the countryside. The urban civilization that defined Rome begins to disintegrate, though some scholars note that this process was uneven across different provinces. Plague makes everything worse, though its demographic impact remains debated among scholars. The Antonine Plague, probably smallpox, sweeps through the empire starting in 165 AD and kills millions, according to contemporary estimates that modern historians treat cautiously. The plague of Cyprian in the 250s allegedly kills thousands daily in Rome at its peak. These plagues don't just reduce population, they destroy the tax base, disrupt agriculture, and create labor shortages. The empire that once had perhaps 60 million people is significantly smaller by the end of the 3rd century, and the remaining population is poorer, more rural, and less able to support the army that's supposedly defending them. Here's what temporarily saves Rome. A series of military strongmen from the Balkans who, according to most historians, care more about raw power and military efficiency than Roman tradition or the Senate. Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian, and Probus reconquer the breakaway provinces and defeat many invaders through sheer military competence. Aurelian reunites the empire by 274 AD and builds walls around Rome itself, the first time the city has needed fortifications in 600 years. This tells you everything about what many see as Rome's decline. The city that once conquered the world now fears being conquered itself. Diocletian takes power in 284 AD. and attempts what historians consider the most radical reform in Roman history. He understands that the empire is ungovernable in its current form, so he splits it administratively into 4 parts under the Tetrarchy. 2 senior Augusti rule east and west, each with a junior Caesar who will eventually succeed him. The system is designed to prevent civil wars by creating clear succession and dividing administrative responsibility. Diocletian also reforms the army, the bureaucracy, taxation, and the currency. He creates a more openly autocratic system, demanding that subjects prostrate themselves before the emperor in the Persian style. The pretense of the principate is abandoned. This becomes the dominate, essentially open monarchy with divine overtones. But historians point out that Diocletian's reforms reveal a difficult truth. Rome struggles to reform itself without ceasing to be Rome in some fundamental sense. His price controls to combat inflation fail because, as economists note, you cannot legislate away economic reality. His tax reforms increase revenue, but arguably crush what remains of the middle class. His military reforms create a larger but some argue less effective army. His administrative reforms create an expanded bureaucracy that consumes resources. And his succession system, the Tetrarchy, collapses almost immediately after he retires in 305 AD. Within a year, multiple Augustan Caesars are fighting for supremacy, and the empire plunges into yet another civil war that demonstrates the system's fundamental instability. Constantine emerges victorious from this civil war by 324 AD, and he does 3 things that reshape history according to most historians. First, he abandons the Tetrarchy and reunites the empire under sole rule, essentially proving that power sharing among equals is impossible in a system built on autocracy. Second, he converts to Christianity after supposedly seeing a vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, and he makes Christianity the favored religion of the state. Third, he builds a new capital at Byzantium and renames it Constantinople, effectively acknowledging that Rome is no longer the center of the empire. The Christianization of Rome is where historians have fought for 15 centuries about what it meant for the empire's survival. Christian apologists from Augustine onward argue that Christianity saved Rome by providing moral renewal and unity of purpose. Pagan critics from Gibbon onward argue that Christianity weakened Rome by promoting otherworldly views over military virtue and civic duty. The controversial modern consensus among many secular historians is that Christianity was largely irrelevant to Rome's structural survival or collapse. Christian Romans fought as effectively as pagan Romans. Christian emperors were as brutal and pragmatic as pagan ones. Constantine murders his own wife and son. The conversion doesn't stop the invasions, fix the economy, or solve the succession crisis. It just changes which gods people blame when things go wrong, though some historians argue it did provide ideological cohesion that shouldn't be dismissed entirely. What Constantine's new capital does reveal, most scholars agree, is that Rome the city is no longer relevant to Rome the empire. The wealth is concentrated in the east. The major threats are on the Persian and Danube frontiers. The trade routes run through the eastern Mediterranean. Italy has become something of a backwater living on the glory of its past. Constantinople is strategically located, easily defensible, and positioned to control both Europe and Asia. Building it is arguably an admission that the center of gravity has shifted permanently eastward. Rome, the city's population declines from over 1 million under Augustus to perhaps 50,000 by the 5th century, though exact figures are debated. The 4th century also brings what some historians see as the empire's final demographic crisis, Rome is running out of Romans, at least in a traditional sense. This is a controversy that makes some modern historians uncomfortable, but the evidence suggests significant population decline in Italy and shifts in military recruitment. The population of Italy appears to have been declining since the 2nd century based on archaeological evidence. Plague, low birth rates among the elite, economic decline, and the constant drain of military service hollow out the peninsula. The Roman army hasn't been recruited primarily from Italy for generations. It draws from the provinces, especially the Balkans, and increasingly from Germanic peoples beyond the frontier. By the 4th century, historians estimate that the majority of soldiers in Roman armies are not ethnically Roman. They're legally Roman. They fight under Roman standards, but they're Goths, Franks, Vandals, and Alemanni, who have been recruited or allowed to settle in the empire as foederati. Here's where the story gets complicated in ways that challenge traditional narratives. Those barbarian invasions that supposedly destroy Rome in the 5th century aren't straightforward invasions in the traditional sense. Modern historians increasingly see them as migrations of peoples who are already partially integrated into the Roman system, often fleeing worse threats from the east and being allowed into the empire by Roman authorities who desperately need their military manpower. The line between Roman and barbarian has become so blurred that some scholars argue it's nearly meaningless by this point. Roman generals are often of Germanic origin. Germanic generals command Roman troops. Germanic federates defend Roman provinces. Germanic kings rule as Roman officials. The Gothic migration of 376 AD reveals this complexity perfectly. The Goths appear at the Danube frontier as refugees, fleeing the Huns who are sweeping across the steppes from Central Asia. Emperor Valens sees what he thinks is an opportunity. Let the Goths cross the river, settle them in Thrace, and recruit them as soldiers. It's the same policy Rome has followed for centuries with other tribes. But Roman officials immediately abuse the arrangement according to contemporary sources, starving the Goths, demanding bribes, even allegedly selling them dog meat at extortionate prices. The Goths rebel, and in 378 AD at the Battle of Adrianople, they destroy a Roman army and kill Emperor Valens in what most historians consider one of Rome's worst military defeats. Adrianople should be a watershed moment that changes Roman policy, but the empire's response is revealing. Make peace with the Goths, settle them in the Balkans as foederati anyway, and recruit them into the army. What else can Rome do? There aren't enough Roman recruits available. The frontiers must be defended. The Goths want land and recognition within the system, not the destruction of the empire itself, so they become Romans, after a fashion, and the pattern repeats with other tribes. One controversial interpretation suggests that Rome doesn't fall to barbarian conquest so much as it absorbs so many barbarians that the distinction between Roman and barbarian becomes increasingly meaningless. The empire splits permanently in 395 AD when Theodosius dies and divides it between his two sons, though whether this was inevitable or avoidable remains debated. The eastern half, centered on Constantinople, remains wealthy, defensible, and relatively stable. It evolves into what we call the Byzantine Empire and survives for another 1,000 years. The western half, theoretically centered on Rome but actually governed from Milan or Ravenna, begins its final collapse. The split reveals what many historians argue. There were always two quite different empires pretending to be one. The East is urbanized, wealthy, Greek-speaking, and economically self-sufficient. The West is increasingly rural, poor, Latin-speaking, and dependent on North African grain that it's about to lose. The 5th century is where everything accelerates, and the Western Empire admits it's dying. though the process takes 76 years. In 406, the Rhine frontier collapses on New Year's Eve when multiple Germanic tribes cross the frozen river, though some historians debate whether this was a coordinated invasion or opportunistic migration. The Vandals, Alans, and Suevi marched through Gaul into Spain and eventually North Africa. The Burgundians settle in eastern Gaul. The Franks take over northern Gaul. The Visigoths, who have been Roman allies for decades, sack Rome itself in 410 under their king, Alaric. The sack of Rome in 410 creates psychological shock throughout the Mediterranean that contemporary sources make clear. The city hasn't fallen to foreign enemies in 800 years. Christians and pagans blame each other for the disaster. St. Augustine writes the city of God partly to argue that earthly kingdoms are temporary, and Christians should focus on the heavenly city. But here's what many historians emphasize. Alaric doesn't actually destroy Rome. He's a Roman general who wants recognition and land for his people within the Roman system. He sacks the city for 3 days, takes some portable wealth, and leaves. The buildings remain standing. The population survives. What doesn't survive is the psychological myth of Roman invincibility that had persisted for centuries. The real death blow, according to many economic historians, comes in 439 when the Vandals led by Genseric conquer Carthage and take control of North Africa. This is arguably the catastrophic loss that dooms the Western Empire, though the end takes another generation to finalize. North Africa is the breadbasket that feeds Italy. It's the wealthiest group of provinces in the West. Losing it means Rome, the city, cannot be supplied with adequate grain. It means the Western Emperor loses the majority of his remaining tax base. It means the Vandals now have a fleet and can raid Italy whenever they choose. In 455, Genseric sacks Rome more thoroughly than Alaric did, stripping it of treasures over 14 days. The word vandalism enters European languages as a result of this raid. Britain is already lost by this point, abandoned by the legions who are desperately needed elsewhere. The Romano-British population is left to defend itself against Picts, Scots, and Saxon raiders. They send desperate letters begging for help that never comes. The province fragments into Celtic kingdoms and Germanic settlements, and within a century, people will barely remember it was ever Roman. Spain is divided between Visigothic federates and the remnants of Roman administration. Gaul is split between Burgundians, Visigoths, Franks, and a shrinking core of territory under nominal Roman control. Italy itself faces constant threats. What's left of the Western Empire in the mid-5th century is, according to most historians, a political ghost. The emperor in Ravenna theoretically controls Italy and claims authority over the lost provinces, though everyone knows this is fiction. The army is entirely composed of Germanic federates. The economy barely functions. The population has declined catastrophically from plague and disruption. The infrastructure is decaying, and the emperors are essentially puppets of Germanic generals who hold the real power as Magister Militum, master of soldiers. This is what many see as the final stage of Rome's transformation. Germanic generals serve Rome, defend Rome, and effectively are Rome in any practical sense, but they're not called emperors. Stilicho, half Vandal by birth, defends the empire for decades as Honorius's general. Aetius defeats Attila the Hun at the Catalonian plains in 451, arguably saving Gaul, but he commands an army mostly composed of Visigoths and other federates. When Aetius becomes too powerful, Emperor Valentinian III personally murders him in 454. Then one of Aetius's supporters murders Valentinian the following year. The Western Empire has become what some historians call a parody of itself, going through the motions of imperial government, while actual power lies elsewhere. Ricimer, a Germanic general, makes and unmakes 5 emperors between 456 and 472. He's the real ruler of Italy, but he never claims the imperial title because he's not Roman by birth, and because maintaining the fiction of Roman rule arguably serves his purposes better. His successor Gundobad continues the pattern. Then Orestes, another Germanic general in Roman service, revolts and installs his own son as emperor in 475. The boy's name is Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, and he's perhaps 14 years old according to sources. It's almost poetic that some historians note, the first emperor was Augustus, the last shares his name in diminutive form. He has no real authority, and everyone recognizes this. In 476, Odoacer leads a revolt of Germanic troops in Italy who demand land as payment for their service, the standard arrangement for federates throughout the empire. Orestes refuses because granting them a third of Italy's land would effectively end any pretense of Roman control. Odoacer kills Orestes, deposes Romulus Augustulus without executing him, and sends the imperial regalia to Constantinople with a message. The West doesn't need its own emperor anymore. The Eastern Emperor Zeno can rule the whole empire in theory, while Odoacer rules Italy in practice as the emperor's representative. This is the traditional date for the fall of Rome, September 4th, 476 AD. But here's perhaps the most important controversy in the entire story. Many modern historians argue that nothing fundamentally changes in 476. Odoacer doesn't declare himself king of a new Germanic kingdom, at least not initially. He rules as a Roman patrician and magister militum, the same title Germanic generals have held for decades. He maintains Roman law, Roman administration, Roman taxation, and what remains of Roman infrastructure. He protects the Senate, which still meets even though it has no real power. He protects the Pope and the Catholic Church. He mints coins with the Eastern Emperor's image, acknowledging theoretical imperial authority. To people actually living in Italy at the time, this is probably just another military strongman taking control, which has been the pattern for a century. The Senate likely doesn't even notice much difference between Odoacer and Ricimer or any other Germanic strongman who effectively ruled before. The tax collectors still collect taxes. The bishops still run their churches. The landowners still own their estates. Daily life continues in ways that wouldn't suggest a dramatic break with the past. Roman civilization doesn't end in 476. What ends is the political fiction that there's a separate Western Roman emperor. Even that fiction wasn't doing much work by the end, according to most historians. Romulus Augustulus controlled only Italy, and even that barely. The provinces were already independent kingdoms ruled by Germanic kings who called themselves Roman officials when it was convenient. So when did Rome actually fall? Historians genuinely disagree on this fundamental question. If you mean the political entity ruled by emperors claiming descent from Augustus, it died gradually between 406, when the frontiers collapsed permanently, and 476, when everyone stopped pretending there was a Western emperor. If you mean Roman civilization, culture, law, and administration, many scholars argue it never fell in the West either. It transformed. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced Roman provinces maintained Roman law, used Latin in administration, claimed Roman titles, and preserved Roman culture as best they could. In the East, it definitely never fell. Constantinople continues calling itself Rome for another 1,000 years until the Ottomans conquer it in 1453. What killed Rome, according to most modern historians, wasn't any single factor. It wasn't Christianity making Romans soft, because Christian Romans fought as fiercely and brutally as pagan ones. It wasn't lead poisoning from pipes and cookware, which most scholars now dismiss as having any significant impact. It wasn't simple moral decay, which is what every generation says about the next and has little explanatory power. It wasn't even primarily the barbarians who were trying to join Rome and become Roman rather than destroy it. What killed Rome, many historians now argue, was a combination of fundamental contradictions built into the system from the moment Augustus created the Principate. Rome built an empire that pretended to be a republic, ruled by an autocrat who pretended to be a citizen, defended by an army that increasingly chose its own commanders through violence, funded by conquest that eventually had to stop, administered by a system designed for a city-state now stretched across 3 continents, and held together by the shared myth of eternal Rome that died the moment people seriously questioned it. One interpretation suggests the empire was built on continuous military expansion and couldn't adapt when expansion stopped. It was built on Italian manpower that declined and disappeared. It was built on Mediterranean trade that required security it could no longer guarantee. It was built on civic institutions that atrophied under 3 centuries of autocracy. The succession system never worked properly, and arguably couldn't work because Augustus refused to create either an actual monarchy or restore an actual republic. He created an ambiguous hybrid that functioned only when you had competent emperors, and there was no mechanism to ensure competence except luck and occasional adoption. Some economic historians argue the system never worked sustainably long-term because it was more extractive than productive. Once you stopped conquering and enslaving new populations, the wealth stopped flowing in, and the empire began consuming itself. The military system contained its own contradiction because giving soldiers the power to make emperors meant they would make new emperors whenever they wanted better pay or conditions. The demographic changes couldn't be easily reversed because, some scholars argue, Roman culture devalued productive labor, relied heavily on slavery in certain sectors, and created economic conditions that made raising children increasingly difficult for everyone, except the wealthy elite, who often chose to have few children anyway. The administrative system struggled to adapt to the empire's size, because that would require admitting the republican forms were obsolete and accepting open monarchy, which Romans resisted until arguably too late to matter. The religious conflicts between pagans and Christians didn't help stability, but most historians now see them as symptoms rather than fundamental causes. An empire this structurally dysfunctional would likely have collapsed regardless of whether Romans worshipped Jupiter or Christ. Here's perhaps the most controversial truth that many historians now accept. Rome was always going to fall eventually because all empires fall. No political system lasts forever. The miracle isn't that it collapsed in the 5th century. The miracle is that it lasted as long as it did, held together by institutional inertia, military professionalism, legal sophistication, cultural prestige, and the desperate efforts of millions of people who believed in Rome, even as reality crumbled around them. The soldiers who died defending frontiers they probably knew were indefensible. The bureaucrats who collected taxes in provinces that would be gone within years. The senators who maintained forms that no longer meant anything. The bishops who preserved literacy and law after the emperors disappeared. These people kept Rome functioning for centuries after the system should have collapsed completely. And here's the final twist that many scholars emphasize. Rome never actually died in any simple sense. It transformed into something else, and that something else continued to call itself Roman. The Germanic kingdoms used Roman titles and maintained Roman forms. Theodoric the Ostrogoth ruled Italy as the emperor's representative and maintained Roman administration so effectively that some contemporaries barely noticed the empire had ended. The Frankish kingdom preserved Roman law in modified form. The Catholic Church preserved Latin and Roman culture throughout the medieval period. Charlemagne crowned himself Roman emperor in 800 AD, claiming to restore what had been lost. The Holy Roman Empire lasted until 1806, always claiming Roman legitimacy. The Russians called their rulers czars, derived from Caesar. The Ottomans claimed to be the third Rome after conquering Constantinople. Every European nation has claimed at various points to be Rome's legitimate heir. Rome didn't simply fall and disappear. It metastasized, spreading its cultural DNA so thoroughly through Western civilization that we're still living in its shadow 1,500 years later. We use its alphabet to write. We speak languages either descended from Latin or heavily influenced by it. We organize our governments on Roman republican models even when they're actually democracies or constitutional monarchies that Rome wouldn't quite recognize. We base our legal systems on principles derived from Roman law. We study Roman literature, philosophy, and history as foundational to Western education. We build our important government buildings to resemble Roman temples. We name our institutions with Latin words: Senate, Congress, Capitol, Forum, Republic. The fall of Rome isn't a safely concluded historical event that happened long ago with no relevance today. Many historians see it as a mirror reflecting what happens when empires built on unsustainable foundations refuse to reform until it's too late. It's arguably a warning about the limits of military power, the dangers of extreme wealth inequality, the consequences of political dysfunction, and the inevitable decline of systems that cannot adapt to changed circumstances. Every declining power looks at Rome and sees uncomfortable parallels. The British in the 19th century, the Americans in the 21st. Everyone who builds an empire believes they'll somehow avoid Rome's fate, and so far, everyone has failed to do so permanently. One interpretation suggests the barbarians didn't kill Rome so much as Rome killed itself, through centuries of accumulated contradictions that everyone saw developing and nobody had sufficient power or will to fix. Any reform radical enough to save the empire would have destroyed what made it Roman in the eyes of contemporaries. The choice was between slow collapse while maintaining Roman identity and revolutionary transformation that would abandon it. Rome chose to die as itself, rather than survive as something unrecognizably different. Whether that's failure or the ultimate expression of Roman values depends on your perspective and what you value. Perhaps there's something admirable about refusing to compromise your civilization's core identity, even when survival demands it. Or perhaps, as some historians argue, it's just the final act of imperial arrogance. Better to drag the world down with you than admit your system was flawed from the very beginning and needed fundamental reimagining that pride wouldn't allow.